Hello YouTube. So in this video I want to talk about uselessness. There are a great deal of philosophical debates that seem to be useless. They have no particular practical value. I'm sure you can think of many examples of useless philosophy, but for instance, the debates about external world skepticism. So there are plenty of skeptical arguments that challenge our justification for belief in the external world. For instance, if you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, you don't know that you have hands. You don't know you're not a brain in a vat, so you don't know you have hands. Many skeptical arguments like this, and I mean, that doesn't really have any sort of practical use at all, right? Like maybe we want to know whether or not there's an external world, but it's not like we're really going to be, so if I can provide a justification for belief in the external world, or indeed if I think about these arguments and decide that there is no justification for belief in the external world, that doesn't really seem to make any practical difference. Arguably. And there are many philosophical debates like this. Philosophy seems to be impractical. Now, there are lots of people who object to this, lots of philosophers even, who are urging for philosophical reform. This is a sort of view that's often expressed by people in pragmatist or naturalist traditions. And there's a really nice article by Daniel Dennett that kind of expresses this sort of attitude quite nicely, I think. So Dennett wrote this short article called "The Higher Order Truths About Chess," and Dennett starts by saying, look, lots of people are interested in chess, and there are many truths about chess. So, for instance, it is a truth of chess that there are 20 legal opening moves for white. It is a truth of chess that a king and a lone bishop cannot achieve checkmate. But then Dennett says, well, imagine this new game called chess. Chess is just like chess, except the king can move 2 squares instead of 1. Now, just as there are many truths about chess, there are going to be many truths about chess, and it would require a great deal of intelligence and hard work and dedication to discover all of the truths about chess. But it would be pointless, right? Like we can imagine people sitting down and spending years of their lives working out the truths about chess, but who cares? It's a total waste of time. And the worry that a lot of people have is a lot of philosophy is going to end up looking like trying to work out the truths about chess. It's just a waste of time. And so the thought is that philosophy should be more oriented towards like practical outcomes, practical utility. I'm going to refer to the people who hold this view as practicalists. And again, I think a lot of people in sort of pragmatist traditions, in the naturalist traditions, and so on, are going to be practicalists in this sense. So practicalists are people who object that large parts of philosophy are useless and that philosophy should be reformed so that it has more practical value. Now, I am not a practicalist. I like uselessness. In fact, if I'm in a particularly contrarian mood, I might even say that uselessness is a theoretical virtue within philosophy. Uselessness is a good thing. And in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I'm not a practicalist. So, first question. So practicalism is the view that a lot of philosophy is useless and that we should reform it so that it has more utility. The first question here is, well, what exactly is uselessness? There's actually a problem with even framing this whole debate, because it seems that what counts as a useful or useless theory is going to be heavily dependent on my goals, right? Like, so if my goal is just to talk about external world skepticism and explore the arguments for and against external world skepticism, and then I do that, then what I have done is not useless for me. It's satisfied my goals. So in general, if my aim is to do philosophy in the traditional way, and I succeed in doing that, then it's not useless. And of course, there's likely to be other benefits as well. I mean, so it might be that by talking about external world skepticism, this helps me to create popular YouTube videos, or maybe it helps me to sell books, or as I have discussed in some previous videos, maybe it helps to alleviate my fear of death. These all seem to be practically useful things. And so, of course, this point kind of threatens to pull the rug out from under the whole debate between the practicalists and the anti-practicalists. So I think what I'm going to say here is we can just specify, look, we can think about, when I talk about practical utility here, we can think about it in a fairly colloquial sense, right? So the thought is that there are various, what are colloquially thought of as practical problems. So within the sciences, for example, like we want theories that deliver true predictions. Within our everyday lives, we want to have kind of social systems that satisfy people's interests. And so philosophy, practical philosophy, is philosophy that helps to improve the practice of science, or it's helping to improve social systems. So it's helping to, or in some way playing some sort of role in alleviating poverty, or promoting democracy, or creating theories that deliver novel predictions, etc. And so I think if we just kind of keep that idea of utility in mind, utility in the colloquial sense, then the practicalist is somebody who says philosophy should be achieving that. Okay, so why am I not a practicalist in that sense? Well, the first point is fairly straightforward. It's this. It seems really obvious to me that not everything that human beings do needs to be oriented towards practical payoffs. A good example of this would be the whole tradition of art, right? Creating art, creating and interpreting and engaging with art. A lot of art is basically useless. Now, it doesn't have to be, so there are some developments in art that have had useful applications. The invention of perspective, like linear perspective in art, that helps us to, if we can create more realistic representations or whatever, that might have certain practical utility when it comes to teaching people about things. If you want to create a realistic drawing of anatomy or something like that. Similarly, art may be used for the purposes of political propaganda. So it does have these practical consequences, but there's a great deal of art that just has no practical utility at all. And I think if you engage with art with the goal of, okay, what are the sort of practical outcomes of this, you're missing a great deal of what is so rich and rewarding about the arts. Art for art's sake, right? You can do art for art's sake. In the same way, why not philosophy for philosophy's sake? Speaking for myself, I can say that, look, the basic motivation for me getting into philosophy, and I think this is true for a lot of other people as well, is that I'm just interested in philosophical questions for their own sake. I'm interested in thinking about, about the world, about knowledge, about human beings in a philosophical way. I'm interested in asking philosophical questions for them, and that's it, right? There's no further goal. I think that in general, it seems to be the case that human beings have some sort of drive to create artistic representations just for their own sake. And in the same way, I think human beings are curious and reflective, and they like to kind of think conceptually. They like to sort of step back from practices and reflect on them in philosophical ways. That seems to be a sort of drive that a lot of people have. It's interesting that in the Dennett article, he uses this example of chess, right? Because there are actually a lot of people who are really interested in chess variants. I don't know, maybe chess isn't a particularly interesting chess variant, but I guess that I would have thought that's just because chess is so similar to chess. But of course, when you start thinking in terms of chess variants and the fact that there's loads of people who play chess variants and are interested in them for their own sake, then I don't know, talking about the higher order truth, the higher truths about chess doesn't strike me as so unusual. But anyway, yeah, I think that there is a sort of drive for philosophical reflection in the same way as there's a sort of drive for creating art. I mean, think about the sort of circumstances in which human beings have created art. People create art in the most horrific circumstances. People in poverty, people during plague, people during war, during the worst periods of human history. There have been people creating art just for its own sake, just to express themselves or just to represent something. They just have this drive to do that. And I think the same is true for philosophical questioning. As long as, as long as the sort of higher cognition is online, there are going to be people who have that drive. And I think that there might be, in psychology, there's this thing, the paradox of happiness, which is if you aim to be happy, if your goal is to be happy, that can actually interfere with your ability to achieve happiness. So, in order to be happy, the way to do that is to have other goals that are not directly related to happiness. So, like, I can make myself happy by, I don't know, maybe somebody might say starting a family, for instance, or taking on some sort of project like creating art. Doing those things and satisfying those goals makes people happy. Whereas if your goal is happiness, that's not going to make you happy. And in the same way, I wonder if there might be a sort of paradox of practicality, right? Where to aim for practical payoffs, if that's just your aim, is to have certain practical payoffs, that might lead to a sort of shallower life. So that might end up actually interfering with your ability to get those practical payoffs. Because I mean, one of the practical payoffs is going to be like happiness, or a sense that one's own, the sense that one's life has been rich and rewarding. So in that sense, there might be a paradox of practicality. Practicality might be an impractical aim. That's just a thought. But anyway, what is clear to me, I think, is I think philosophy for philosophy's sake is fine. I don't think it needs any further justification. Okay, then. So that's one point. Now, a second point is, when we think about the sort of traditional goals of philosophy, it strikes me that philosophy can have many goals that are just unrelated to practical utility. One obvious example of this would be a lot of philosophers are aiming to achieve truth or knowledge or something in that domain. Philosophers want to uncover the truths about the world, or they want to uncover the scope and limits of knowledge. Now, when we look at truth and knowledge, there's no obvious connection to practical utility, and indeed there is some indication that truth and practical utility may come apart. So here's an everyday example. Take mapping. Right, if you go onto the underground tube in places like London, right, the tube trains in London, they all have these like maps, and the maps of the tube stations totally misrepresent the spatial relations. So when you look at an underground tube map, it's basically just a load of straight lines. They'll have like dots along a straight line, and it sort of tells you what station you're at and what station is going to come next, and that's it. And all of the, the curves and bends and all of that, the map just totally misrepresents all of that stuff. But by misrepresenting it, it makes it much simpler, much more easy for the map users to actually understand, right? So when you get onto one of those underground tube trains, what you care about is, well, what station am I at? What station's coming next? What direction is this train going? That's it. That's all you actually care about. So, when we use maps, simplify, abstract, idealize, and that improves their utility. And this is, I think, this is something that just crops up kind of everywhere. It's just a general feature of modeling the world. In the sciences, idealization is everywhere. Idealization is ubiquitous. Scientists will, they will model things as if they were composed of ideal gases, or they'll model populations as if they had an infinite number of members, or they'll, talk about frictionless planes. I mean, these things are not true. The world is not really like that. So when we look at a lot of scientific models, if you just take them at face value, it seems like they contain a lot of falsehoods, or at least they contain a lot of like misrepresentations, or at least there are aspects of those models that are not just truly representing the way we think the world is. But the reason why we do that is because it has all sorts of practical payoffs. So it looks like we can get utility from misrepresentation. Actually, there's a really nice story by I'm going to pronounce his name wrong. I think is it Jorge Luis Borges or something, Borges. He has this story of cartographers trying to come up with a perfect map. So they're trying to map a city, and like maybe it starts off with just a simple like A4 piece of paper, and they start representing it that way. Then they add more and more and more detail, and so they start showing the buildings, showing the roads, then they show the different rooms in the buildings, and then they decide to make a 3D model to make it even more realistic, and then they make it bigger and bigger so they can add more into the model. And of course, eventually what they end up with is just a one-to-one perfect representation of the city, but it's totally useless as a map because it's just a copy of the city. So truth and utility seem to come apart. Now, okay, so philosophers are generally interested in truth and knowledge. They're interested, they think about, okay, what is truth? What is knowledge? How do we know when we've achieved truth or knowledge? It seems like it's worth reflecting on these questions. The obvious place to do that would be philosophy. And there is at least some reason to think that practicality is not a particularly good guide here. Now, of course, you might say, well, okay, then what is the, okay, so here's one objection, right? So you might say, well, look, utility is the only guide that we have to the truth. If you're asking about truth and knowledge, utility is the only guide that we have. So the only way that we know that science, for instance, gets close to the truth is because of its predictive and technological success, right? Because of its enormous practical benefits. If science didn't have that, then so like the reason why we might trust that scientific theories provide correct descriptions of the world, or the reason why we might trust that science gets to the truth about the world, is because of this practical technological utility, predictive success and use in constructing technologies. So utility is really the only guide to the truth, even if there are cases where utility and truth can come apart. I would just point out, yes, I mean, that's okay, fair enough, maybe, perhaps. So perhaps utility is the only guide to the truth, but that is in itself a substantive philosophical claim. There are many other ways of conceiving of epistemology. We might favor some sort of rationalist epistemology where we think that we can figure out the truth by going with what is self-evident to reason or something, or we might favor some intuitionist epistemology. We might take a sort of skeptical line and say, actually, nothing is a good guide to the truth. Now, the important point is that is a substantive philosophical debate, and it's not clear how resolving that debate is going to have any practical payoff whatsoever. So at this point, we're now back into traditional philosophy. So when you ask the question, well, what is a good guide to the truth? Okay, bearing in mind that truth and utility can come apart, what is the right approach in epistemology? Once you're asking those sorts of questions, you're back into traditional philosophy. You're no longer realizing practicalism, right? You're just doing philosophy in the traditional sense. And this brings me to another point, which is, I suppose, a kind of a sort of U2 argument, a tu quoque argument. And it's a general worry I have about this sort of practicalist approach to philosophy, which is when we look at what the philosophical practicalists are doing, generally speaking, they are philosophers talking to other philosophers. So if we look at scientists or political activists or whatever, they don't care about practicalism. They may well be practically oriented in the colloquial sense, right? They may be pragmatists in the colloquial sense, but they certainly don't care about this as a philosophical movement. And I mean, why would they, right? I mean, how would being concerned about philosophy and the right way to do philosophy and philosophical reform, that's not going to have any obvious, that's not going to help people construct, explanatory theories that deliver successful novel predictions. That's not going to help people, promote democracy or solve world hunger or anything like that. So, philosophical practicalism doesn't do anything to achieve those goals. So here's the point, right? If you're so what the philosophical practicalists are saying is, we need to reform philosophy so that it has these practical payoffs. But if what you care about are the practical payoffs, you can just focus on that, right? You can kind of skip all of the stuff about philosophy and just work on the practical stuff. For instance, if your goal is to develop scientific theories that exhibit testable novel predictions, you could just do that. Just become a scientist. If your goal is to help solve world poverty, you can just do that. You can just start, join some organization that is concerned with alleviating poverty, join some charity or something, or take part in some political activism. Talking to other philosophers and trying to promote practicalism as a philosophical movement does not actually further the goals that you say you have. It's completely useless. So yes, I mean, it may be the case that what I'm doing is totally useless, but I have a funny feeling that in a lot of cases, I'm not going to say all cases, but in a lot of cases, the philosophical practicalists, what they're doing is useless as well, at least by their own standards. I mean, look, I should say, there are some practicalists who kind of put their money where their mouth is. Dan Dennett, for instance, has made genuine contributions to cognitive science, beyond mere philosophy. At least I think. But I mean, even with someone like that, I think, couldn't you make a more significant impact? Couldn't you better realize your practical goals by just leaving philosophy entirely? So that's sort of yes. That's my case for anti-practicalism in philosophy. Now, final point I want to make. There is a worry about what I'm saying here, which is, philosophy already has a kind of PR problem. There are lots of people who don't really take philosophy that seriously. There are, philosophy clearly has problems getting funding and so on. And if if philosophers just started to embrace anti-practicalism in the way that I am, if philosophers were just like, yeah, what I'm doing is completely useless, and I like that, then it's going to be even more difficult to secure funding. It's going to be even more difficult to get the rest of society to take philosophy seriously. So I just want to say a couple of things about this. First of all, this worry is in itself an appeal to practical utility, right? The argument is saying that, like, by embracing uselessness, this is going to have like negative practical consequences. But I've just told you I don't care about the practical payoffs. I don't care about that. So obviously this sort of argument isn't going to move me. But there's a second point, which is, I think that the reason why philosophy has a PR problem isn't really anything to do with the kind of content of philosophical theories or the practical payoffs of doing philosophy. I think the problem is more to do with the incentive structure in academic philosophy. So in academic philosophy, there is basically no value at all to public engagement. Everything that I've done on YouTube is it probably does nothing in terms of, if my goal was to get an academic career, what I've done on YouTube has been worse than a waste of time, because I would have put myself in a much better position if, instead of creating YouTube videos, I was just publishing articles in academic journals that nobody outside of academic philosophers would read. So the point is that, if you're trying to become an academic philosopher, there's not really any value in public engagement. And actually, if you're doing public engagement, you're probably wasting time. You should probably be spending that time doing other things, just going to philosophy conferences, publishing in philosophy journals. You should be doing things that nobody outside of the small circle of academic philosophers is going to be paying attention to. And so I think that that's why people don't, that society in general doesn't really care that much about philosophy. It's because we, academic philosophers just do not, like, they're not putting the value on that public engagement stuff. And I think if we did start valuing public engagement more, we would find that a lot of people are actually very interested in useless philosophy, in the same way that they are very interested in useless art. I would point out that if we think about the philosophical problems that have captured the public imagination, they seem to be useless problems, right? So, I mean, I just opened with external world skepticism. One of the philosophical problems that has, I think, garnered like a lot of public interest more recently are things like the simulation argument. The idea that the whole universe might be a simulation. That seems to be something that has a sort of broad. There's a broad range of interest in that. So, and that again, I mean, whether or not we're in a simulation, that doesn't. Who cares, right? Whether like it's not going to have any practical consequences if it turns out that the whole universe is some sort of simulation. Okay, that doesn't make a difference to anything, right? That doesn't help me solve any practical problems. So I think useless philosophy is wonderful. I think that a lot of people, even non-philosophers, are also interested in useless philosophy. And so this is just my defense of uselessness. I do want to end by saying, look, I'm not saying that there is anything wrong with practical philosophy, okay? There are plenty of people out there who really love science, but they just never had the talent to actually become scientists. There are plenty of people out there who want to change the world, but they don't really have the guts to put their own well-being on the line and get involved with serious activism. Practical philosophy is a good place for them. So I don't want to shut down practical philosophy. I just think it's fine to do useless philosophy as well. Okay. That bit at the end there was like, that's just a bit of banter. Practical philosophy is really cool too, okay? But so is the useless stuff.